our introduction slideshow because I want to make time for Dr. Cressup's presentation. So we'll go ahead and introduce our hub team members. I'm Krista Opstedal. I am the Project ECHO Director here at the North Dakota Center for Persons with Disabilities at Minot State. And prior to my role here at the center, I was a DSP for 4 years, and then I served as a Program Director of Assistive Technology and taking on a bunch of special projects, including advocacy efforts. So we'll go ahead and introduce the rest of our team. Jessica, do you want to unmute?
Hi, good morning. I'm Jessica Reiswig. I work at Minot State University, and I am Krista's support on this ECHO project.
Thank you, Jessica. And Linda Anderson.
Have a hard time finding the mute. I'm Linda Anderson. I work at the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration, which is a similar organization to Minot. We're a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And I have been a DSP for many years and also a program manager. So I'm really interested in workforce and work-life balance and things like that for DSPs.
Thank you, Linda. It's been a really great partnership and we appreciate everybody coming on to this project. All right, and Jen.
Good morning, everyone. Great to see you. I also work with Linda at the Institute on Community Integration on the University of Minnesota campus. I'm a former DSP, job coach, and case manager, and we do a lot of work at our center on helping to improve the lives and support direct support professionals as well as people with disabilities. And I am so happy to be here today and so excited for our presentation. Thank you.
And we also have Jody Patchen on our team. She is gone today for an appointment. So you guys may receive some emails from her after this session. So just so you know, she is part of our team here. So we'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Linda Cressup. Dr. Cressup started her teaching career at MSU in 1986 and was the chair of the business Oops.
It's okay.
Oh. Sorry, I lost my presentation. Where did that go?
I'm sorry, I did it.
Okay. No worries, no worries.
I shut you down.
So she was the chair of Business Information Technology Department from July 2004 to May 2004, and she was the dean of the graduate school from May 2005 to June 2012. She currently directs the Masters of Science in Sports Management program. Dr. Cressup teaches online and on-campus classes in leadership communications, organizational collaboration, and business communication. She also coordinates the prior learning assessment program in the College of Business. Dr. Cressup is a peer reviewer for the Higher Learning Commission and the International Association of Collegiate Business Education. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Linda Cressup, our speaker for today.
Thank you. I guess I don't need to introduce myself. You did a great job, more than I thought. So just one more piece of information for you. I was recently appointed as the director to the graduate school, which is the same job I did 10 years ago as the dean of the graduate school, just with a different title. So I've made full circle. I actually went back to teaching 10 years ago because that's my passion, and I'm back here. So what I want to do today is provide you a little bit of information about leadership communication. These are the topics. I want to talk about leadership communication styles, some different approaches to leadership, and then focus a little more on authentic leadership, which is something Krista had indicated is an important area for you. And then also just talk about the communication strategy, which is kind of the wrap up of communication. If you don't have the strategy, you can't really get where you're going. Feel free to interrupt me if you have a question. It's probably easier than putting something in the chat. Although if you want to put something in the chat, Krista, maybe you can monitor that and let me know. I do tend to talk fast. If I'm going too fast, please let me know. So to start, leadership is at the core of the human experience. If you are a leader, or if you exercise those leadership skills, you're going to probably have more positive experiences working with others. Leadership is a symbolic activity, and the main thing that's important to you here is that leadership focuses on who you are, how you act, what you do and how you work with others. And as you look through those concepts, you realize that those are all communication related. Who you are, how you communicate tells people who you are, how you act, what you do, and so on. So leadership requires communication. And there are 5 specific areas of communication that help you become more strong in develop strength in your leadership skills. The first one is willingness to communicate. So when you think about willingness to communicate, I'm sure you can think of someone who is that willingness to communicate person. And perhaps you're thinking of the person who over communicates, the person like me who talks a lot, is very expressive, that kind of person. At the same time, the willingness to communicate is that willingness to interact with others. The more you interact, the more you're able to develop those effective skills to be a good communicator. And as well, you then influence others. And we'll talk about that as an approach to leadership at a later point. People who are willing to communicate, to develop those skills in communication are also thought of as being more credible and generally are considered impression leaders or opinion leaders, excuse me. Additionally, the more you communicate, the more you often develop your confidence in that specific area. Now, just a caveat here, not every culture communicates with speech. Obviously, we have high and low context cultures. The US happens to be a low context, meaning that we communicate with words all the time versus a high context, which is more concerned with that face-to-face nonverbal communication, maybe not focusing so much on that immediate message, but rather the relationship part of it. Another aspect of communication that's very important is storytelling. And storytelling has actually become one of the most popular ways in the business world to get your message across. When you tell a story, you're providing an authentic message, or an authentic version of your message. And so what a story does is it frames that real experience. You can tell a story, and we've all heard stories, right? When you think of a story and you think of a message, you remember the message because that story behind it provides that context. In my class, I teach a graduate level leadership communication class, and one of the probably most challenging, but also the most rewarding assignments that my students do is the storytelling experience. And their key is, what is the message you want to get across? What is the communication or leadership message? Build your story around it. I would share one of their stories with you today, but it wouldn't be as powerful as if they shared it, because it's coming from the heart. It's your story. A good story gives you goosebumps, right? And if you go out and watch a TED Talk, most TED Talks are based on storytelling. When you tell a story, you spark action. You give away who you are as a speaker. You can provide your values; those are going to show. You foster collaboration. Many times when you tell a story, someone connects with that story and continues the discussion. You also obviously share your knowledge. So another area that requires or that is part of leadership communication is that emotional communication competencies. And oftentimes you think about emotional intelligence. Emotional communication competencies are a little bit less different. I need to slow down because they blend your feelings with your thinking. And so as you're thinking through how something would work, you're also considering how you feel about it and how you're going to react. The first thing that you need to do when you're thinking about your communication as an emotional communication competency is you need to be able to perceive and appraise and express your emotions. So identify what's going on with you regarding that situation or topic, and how it's going to impact your way of communicating that particular topic. You need to attend to the emotions of others, which I understand is a huge part of your jobs. So not only being in touch with your own emotions and how they're going to play through, but also the person on the other side. And when we talk about the communication strategy, that's a key area, thinking about that other person. So we'll talk about that more in detail. Another area that's important is you need to consider your overall emotional status in the situation. You also need to understand and analyze the emotional information that you're providing. So how that affects other people, just the concept or the idea itself. And then obviously you need to regulate those emotions. You need to think about how they're portrayed, what kind of knowledge they give to others, and what kind of action you need to take. Another area that's important is impression management. Basically, impression management is how others see you, but you push to them how you want them to see you. Impression management can be looked at as negative, obviously, because that sincerity factor has to be there. We often use impression management. If you watch politicians, they will carefully orchestrate what they're doing to form the impression that they want you to get from them. Example, when you compare President Trump with President Clinton, I'm sorry, that's not a good one. President Clinton with President Obama. President Clinton was very relationship oriented, so he would spend time connecting with people, versus President Obama, who was much more task oriented. So he would spend more time getting the job done. And those exact impressions are what they wanted. They wanted us to see that they did those kinds of things differently. Another part of impression management is the type of leader that fits with that. Oftentimes people who are good at impression management are referred to as being charismatic. They can push that image that you want them to have. Okay, and finally, that communication strategy, I'm going to put that at the end and talk about it more specifically, but communication strategy is a key to successful communication. Okay, so leadership styles, I'm sure you've heard of these before. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing you have. The two models, the basic model we've heard about for years, authoritarian, democratic, laissez-faire. And everyone, I always ask my students at the beginning of the class, which one are you? Well, they're all democratic, right? Nobody wants to be either of the other two. So when you think about authoritarian, think about task-oriented. That's really what I'm concerned about. I'm strict on my rules, policies, procedures, get it done. Kind of the only thing, or not the only thing, but the main focus I have is get the job done. Democratic, on the other hand, pulls in, I need to get the job done, but I also need to think about the people that I'm working with. I need to collaborate with them and bring them into the decisions and those kinds of things. And laissez-faire is, we're going to leave you alone. You do your thing. As long as you do you, I'll do me, and we'll all come together at the end and things will be wonderful. And I'm thinking you're all thinking, I'm that democratic person, I'm right in the middle. Not always true. If you're familiar too with McGregor's X and Y theory, X is the thought authoritarian, Y is democratic, laissez-faire doesn't fit on the scale. We're going to focus more on task versus interpersonal. Now, task does not mean you're authoritarian necessarily. Tasks means your major focus might be to this side. You're more concerned with the task. That doesn't mean you're not interpersonal, but the task is primary. Interpersonal, the person is primary. So prior to this session, Krista sent out a questionnaire, a leadership style questionnaire to you. And in that questionnaire, after you responded to each of the statements, you were able to get an idea of where you are task and interpersonal wise. And can I ask a question, Krista? Can they respond, or is that going to be too clunky in this particular session? Okay, so would anybody like to volunteer where you turned out on the scale and whether or not you were surprised by your results? Anyone? Krista, did you do the survey? Where did you end up?
I ended up on interpersonal almost to a fault.
Okay.
Like almost too concerned with the relationships, and like the tasks can go on the wayside, which is not ideal some days.
Okay. Anyone end up on the task side or on the interpersonal and you expected to be in a different place?
So there's some people responding in chat.
Oh, there are. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not looking at chat. I can
So
do
somebody
that.
has the same score for both.
Okay.
Somebody higher than interpersonal. Somebody kind of in the middle, kind of both,
Yep.
kind of in the 30s. Higher interpersonal, not surprised at all.
Yeah.
That's Jen, and I could have scored Jen probably.
Yes. And oftentimes we can score each other. Well, I have to say I'm not surprised at the results. I did anticipate, because of the type of profession you're in, you would be more relationship oriented. I found too that that's where we want to be. We want to say we're the person that is concerned about people, not the task. Generally, when I talk to students who are more business oriented, that task comes out more often. It's interesting that I teach both sports majors and business majors, and my sports students, I have to say, are more interpersonal. They're working on teams, they're more collaborative, that kind of thing. My business people, let's get the job done. Oh yeah, we'll be nice to people too, but let's get the job done. I would anticipate some of you are closer to the middle, and that's a good thing as well. Let's take a look at just a few of the descriptors for these two types. And again, this will probably solidify where you came out. I selected more of the positive traits rather than the negative. There's obviously a list on both sides of why this isn't good, but that's not what we're concerned about. So the task leader is the person who disseminates the information versus the interpersonal who asks for input, right? The task focuses on those facts, the data, the information, versus the interpersonal who focuses more on the feelings of the person receiving the information, their attitudes, their emotions as they relate to that person. The task person communicates in writing versus, oh, and I have a nice typo here. The interpersonal orientation is more communicating orally, not whatever that says. Interestingly, when I was reviewing this for my own purposes, I thought, okay, I can pick out all of those writing people and previous employers, leaders who, if they needed to say something, writing was their preference versus oral. And if you think about people nowadays, they prefer, text, writing, anything that they can get away from actually that face-to-face environment. So that gave me kind of an interesting thought pattern as far as interpersonal, those who prefer oral over writing. The task emphasizes productivity, acquisition of technical skills versus productivity with people skills. And then of course, task, they're going to make demands versus interpersonal, they're going to make requests. I want this to be how I do this instead. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about leadership approaches. Now, task, interpersonal are your styles, but within those styles, you play out different ways of approaching your leadership. So even though you're specifically interpersonal, you may take a different approach to how you play out that style in these different ways. Please keep in mind as I review this, I'm giving you the basics on these. There's a lot of research. There are a lot of studies on how all of these work. There's a lot of detail. I'm just giving you the basics here so you can maybe identify, yeah, I get that one. So the traits approach is and the situational approach also focus on the individual. In traits, it's a person who approaches leadership is a traits way, is approaching it strictly from the idea of being smart. They have high cognitive abilities. Those people take responsibility for their rewards based on what they've done. They're looking for, they're motivated, they have good social skills. When I think about traits, I think about students working in groups and the student who basically takes over as a group leader. And specifically, that person perceives to have a higher level of knowledge, but also that fact that their goal here is the reward. And so they're going to achieve their leadership through the reward that they get, and they feel that they've got control over that effort. Versus situational, where it depends, right? It depends on the situation that I'm in. Situational approaches generally are more that task and interpersonal, a combination of the two. I have to think about what I have to get done. I have to think about who I'm working with, and it depends on where I'm at the time. What kind of situation am I in? Functional is more of a behavior. I can be a leader. I have the skills and I can do it, but maybe I don't have to all the time. So sometimes you're the leader, sometimes you're not. It depends on whether you need to be, but you have the functional abilities to do it. So maybe the person who sits back and waits to see if they need to be the leader. Skills approach just indicates that you have the skills you need to carry out the functions of being a leader. So you can be an effective leader when you take the skills approach. Relational, of course, the key here is the leader-follower relationship. If you're a leader, you can be a follower. If you're a follower, you can be a leader. The best, oh, I have a nice typo there. The best leader is someone who can be a follower. You can exchange your roles, okay? And then transformational is also the one that everybody in business wants to be transformational. That transformational approach is creative, innovative, visionary, empowering, passionate, often referred to as a charismatic approach to leadership. And again, all of my students want to be transformational. We got into a conversation last night about Amazon and Jeff Bezos, the leader of Amazon, who portrays himself as a very transformational, charismatic leader, yet his employees are not treated well. And so we found that to be interesting. He's innovative, he's passionate, he's motivated, but he doesn't treat his employees well. So he's very task-oriented and probably is very good at impression management. He can make us believe he's a certain person that he isn't. So, and then of course, authentic. And authentic is where we are going to focus a little bit, because that hopefully is the area that is that resonates most with you based on what you do. So authentic leaders, I've got to move my list of you. I've got your pictures on here, and that's all I'm seeing at the moment. When you think about authentic leaders, let me back up just a second. So the idea of authentic leadership is not new. It's not a new idea. In fact, it was created way back with the Greeks and the Romans. And if you think about it from that perspective, know thyself is kind of the key. You know yourself, you know what you're doing. To thine own self be true. Okay, so that's, you've likely all heard those. That's where you think of when you think of authentic leadership. Yourself first, not that you're, not thinking of anybody else, but you have to know yourself in order to be authentic. That is somewhat common sense, I would think, right? Near the turn of the century, early 2000s, there was a series of corporate scandals. Enron, if you remember Enron, we had the Tyco scandal, we had waste management scandal, Wells Fargo. So all of these scandals where people misbehaved, right? They misbehaved at that level. And what happened overall is the researchers and the practitioners said, we have to bring this to a stop. We have to refocus on ethics. We need to reassure the population that everybody is not unethical and behaving that way. Ethics is important. In order to get back to that standard or that way of behaving, authentic leadership came back to the forefront as you're going to be more ethical if you think about yourself and how you lead from an authentic point of view. At the same time, there was a movement on the scholarly side to refocus on authentic leadership. So there's a lot of research done at the time. So authentic leadership, you're leading from an internalized moral perspective. So you have a good feel for what your morals are, your ethical values are, your integrity, and you act from that area. So at the bottom, self-awareness, you're aware of those values. You have an honest and accurate view of your strengths and weaknesses, and you're able to accept those and act on those. You know, this will work, this will not work. You're able to carry forward knowing those things about yourself. Your authentic behavior then is maintaining those values and being resistant to outside pressures. So no matter what, you're going to be true to yourself. And that's one of the issues that didn't happen in some of these scandals. Wells Fargo is a good example where employees were asked to do something that they knew wasn't right, but they succumbed to the pressure and they did it. And so they weren't authentic in the fact, and some of them probably wanted to be, but it wasn't an issue that they could address that way. A student brought forward yesterday an idea about Amazon drivers during COVID being told they had to work. Didn't matter. Actually, it wasn't during COVID, it was during the recent hurricane. You still need to deliver your packages. It doesn't matter. You still need to deliver them. And they had to, even though they knew it wasn't right to be out there doing that. It wasn't beyond values, it was just personal safety. But balanced processing, big one. Listen to others' point of views and don't judge. And we all have to admit that we do judge at times, but listening, allowing those thoughts to come through objectively, thinking fairly, considering and sharing your own thoughts when appropriate. And then that relational transparency, presenting your true self to others, creating relationships based on trust. And you can build trust if you are consistently providing a message, if you're consistently reacting from an authentic point of view, communicating from an authentic point of view. Okay. So something else that's really important with authentic leaders, and in fact, I think it's more important, is the fact that if you're an authentic leader, you influence your followers. Authentic leaders promote positive feelings with their followers, self-efficacy, hope, optimism, resilience. You build your followers up by being authentic yourself, because they learn to trust you. They know that you're consistent. They understand what your strengths and weaknesses are. They understand your integrity, where, so they can be more trustworthy. And that translates into them treating you more as a role model. And of course, then they start building those skills as well. It's a well-known fact in the research that if you're an authentic leader, your followers generally have a higher level of job performance. They believe in you, they trust you. And it's because they also believe in themselves because of that reassurance. They also have a higher commitment to their position, obviously. So interestingly enough, authentic leadership is often identified as both transformational and servant leadership. Servant leadership being working for your followers, and helping those followers succeed. Next slide. So how do I become authentic? And you're probably all thinking, am I authentic? Do I follow this? Well, if you're not sure, how do you become that way? First of all, you have to know yourself. You have to sit down and honestly judge yourself. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? How do I work with other people? Do I stand on my morals? Do I succumb to outside pressure? So you need to know yourself. You need to give yourself time to make an honest assessment. Then you need to connect. If you don't connect, remember that willingness to communicate. If you don't connect, you can't find out how authentic you are. You can't attract those followers. So you can kind of, as you connect, you can find out where you lie on that spectrum. Be discreet. I find when I look at that one, it's kind of slipped in there, but being discreet means you need to be authentic, but you also need to not share the followers' points of view. You need to work with them one-on-one or in building relationships. Again, it's part of that trust value. So you need to think about that. You need to listen, which I already said at one point. Listen, and listen fairly, objectively, openly. Play to your strengths. You know where you're strong, you know where you're weak. So build in your weakness areas, but also know this is my strength. My strength is listening to others and addressing their emotions, maybe assessing their emotions, that emotional competency again. My weakness is I get distracted sometimes with my listening, so I have to refocus. My little voice in my head this year has been listen, because I'm quick to listen, react. And so listen, and my little voice says that all the time. Play to your strengths. I guess I'm backed up a minute there. I'm sorry. Keep requesting feedback. There was a time when we had this 360-degree feedback where you got feedback from everybody that you worked with all around, a little bit overdone, but requesting feedback. Ask your followers, is this, are we understanding? Are we on the same page? How do you feel about doing something this way? What are your ideas? Ask them for feedback at all times. And apply the communication strategy. And this is my baby. I always have to get to this at the end. So just, how are we doing for time, Krista? Are we good? Okay. So the communication process, you're likely familiar with this, but when you think about communication, it's circular, right? You have a communicator, you have an audience or receiver. The communicator sends the message, the audience has to decode the message, send the response, and it just keeps going, right? But what happens in the middle of that? We have barriers. So when I encode the message, I choose how I'm going to send it. I'm going to send a text. I instantly create a barrier because my text wording versus my email wording versus my wording when it's oral, all different, right? Anytime you have a written message, you have to think about the nonverbals. My students get angry with me because I insist that formatting is a thing If you're sending a letter, it has to look like a letter. And of course, they're all very young and think I'm this old crazy person, but there's something to be said about spacing when you write something, or text messaging, choosing the right words, because words in a text, I can read a student's text and go, oh my, what have you said? And they're perfectly clear. So that whole idea of what can happen, culture, actually, I prefer the word diversity now. Diversity comes into play a lot more because it's at the forefront of what we're talking about these days with all the current things going on in our world. So as you think about this process, so much can happen from the time I encode the message, and it's my responsibility to get it right. Because if I don't get it right, it's not going to go where I want it to go, and it's not going to be the right message. So here's what you need to do. Here's the communication strategy. Every time you think about a communication, you should be in the back of your mind thinking through this series of questions. And of course, students write this down. And again, I'm not going to think about this when I send a text. Maybe the focus you want is when you have to, when you have a meeting with a subordinate and you have a tough message to send. Maybe that's when you want to apply it. If you use this, you will eventually, it'll become natural. One of the things when I was working on this presentation is I had to rely on Krista to give me the information about the audience because I don't know you. And so to organize this information for you, she had to provide in the audience part. She had to give me that information. So back to the strategy. First thing you think about is, why am I doing this? And it's amazing how many messages we send that we don't need to. You didn't really have a reason for sending that. You might think of that email back and forth thing you do, blah, 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 blah. And then you go, oh, great, thank you. And then you're welcome. And then what about this? And you go back and forth for a ridiculous amount of time for no reason. So why are you sending the message? If you don't know, then you shouldn't send it until you do know. What style is important? Are you telling me something? Are you selling me something? Are you informing me about something, or are you trying to get me to do something? You're persuading me. And then more importantly, what is your credibility? It goes back to the authentic leadership style, right? Or approach, I'm sorry. What do they think about you? Do you know what you're talking about? Are you authentic? Do you know yourself? Are you dealing with them? What do they think about you? And credibility can be built in many ways. I mean, it can be based on your position. It can be based on your power. It can be based on your knowledge. There's many, that's another lecture, right? So credibility, what do they know about you and what are they going to think? Next and most important is audience. Who are you talking to? Who are you talking to? Are you talking to your mom? Are you talking to your supervisor? Are you talking to the president of, in my case, the president of the university? The message is not the same. It's not structured the same, right? What does your audience know? What do they know about this message? What do they know about you? And what do they expect from this message? If you're giving negative information and they know it's coming, that's a different message, right? How do they feel? How are they going to react? Again, negative message. How are you going to give a negative message? You're going to fire somebody. How do you do that without being so abrupt that they quit reading the message? So thinking about how they're going to feel. And again, authentic leadership, thinking about that interpersonal style. When you focus on the person who's getting the message, you got to get the message across, but you need to get that message across to them, understanding where they're coming from. And then how do you get them to act? How do you inspire them to, even if it's negative, go forward in a positive manner? That's a trick. So the message itself, whoops, indirect or direct. Negative message, I always suggest try the indirect approach. If you're going to tell somebody something negative, give the background first. Give the background to a point where they know this isn't going to be a great message. Something's, I already know this is not good news. And then when you give that bad news, you've softened it a little bit. The other part of that is you get people to read the whole message before you say no, or whatever the negative message might be. If I say no up front, you're not going to read the rest of the message. So direct, indirect depends again on what you're saying. How do you keep their attention? Always keep in mind what you say at the beginning and what you say at the end are what people remember. That middle part, if you think about a story, the middle part in a story is how you keep them, right? You grab my attention at the beginning by encouraging or telling me a story. You grab my attention. I'm waiting to see what happens. You build. And at the top, you say, here's what happened. And I made my decision. And then you go back down, right? And then you give your message. So if you think about that approach, that again emphasizes that idea of storytelling as a communication technique. So you keep their attention. Something else I always encourage people to think about is they're going to remember the end. They're going to remember the beginning. They're going to remember the end. If it's a negative message, don't end by apologizing a second time for that negative information. Go forward. You don't want them the last thing they read to remember what you said, or the last thing you say to remember why this is a bad message. So keeping that in mind. How do you connect with them? Personal information, stories, get them to understand your point of view, but also understand that you know about their point of view. Channel, written, oral, blended. When in doubt, oral is better, especially if you need to ease into something. And again, we all default to written because there's no face there. There's limited nonverbals, that kind of thing. And diversity, big thing. Cultural differences, age. Age is a big one for me right now because I'm a lot older than my students. In fact, I have some of my students, early students, grandchildren. Frightening. Big difference in age, big difference in how we communicate. Sexual orientation is now something you need to be more so than 40 years ago when I started this. Economic status. So there's a lot of things you need to think about, not just cultural diversity, that are important when you think about the strategy. So a lot to think about before you send a message, right? But all of it gets back to being authentic and thinking through what you're going to do as you provide that message or as you move back and forth in that cycle or circle. Okay, so applying your knowledge. Okay, so what we're going to do as we think about how to use this information is we're going to identify what kind of leadership style we have. And we started task, interpersonal, where are you in there? Then think about the approaches you use when you lead, when you communicate. What do? You probably lean 2 or 3 of those are kind of resonating with you. Work towards your authenticity, because that's kind of where we want to go with this. And then consider how you can use that communication strategy as you think through your communication, as you think through how you're going to show and build trust through authenticity as you apply your leadership style. And I think that was my last slide. Do we have time for any questions, Krista, or do you want to move on to your case study?
Yeah, if we have any questions, I think for about 2 minutes, we could ask those. So feel free to throw it into the chat or unmute if you're comfortable.
Yep, I'm going to try to unshare my slides here, and I'm not sure what I've done. I'll just close them. There we go. You don't need to see that. Okay. All right, so let me open the chat. You're welcome. I don't see a lot of messages. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask? It was that speed that got you, right? Need to sort of take a break, a breather, and remember what I said. Anything?
I really appreciated the points on, actively listening. Like, I think that's so much easier said than done. And really that can just mitigate a lot of issues that come up with communication. I work with somebody who is from a Native American reservation, and just actually listening to what was happening in their life and then catching up on these cues. It was just like, oh, okay, there's so much more that's happening beyond what I'm seeing at the surface level. So we were able to connect in a way that I was able to then go to their staff and say, hey, let's try these approaches because this is what they shared with me. And I don't think they would have shared if I would have kept pushing what I needed to say to them versus just listening to where they were coming from.
And you also applied the communication strategy whether you realize it or not.
I did not realize it.
You did, because you thought through, as you talked to that person, you not only listened, but you thought through, okay, what do I do at the next step? How do I take this information and move forward based on what you know? Thoughts, questions?
Linda, I have a question. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was so good.
You're welcome.
do you have any tips or strategies? It really spoke to me in the beginning about the sort of interpersonal or relational leader versus task oriented. And I think really good teams have a balance. But if we find ourselves, such as Krista and I, not saying Krista needs to change, but, really far on one end of the continuum, what tips do you give? For example, I'm high on interpersonal, but I'd like to be better about task oriented. I mean, I have some thoughts, but I guess I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the most important thing is recognizing where you're at. And so that just doing that leadership, because I would look at it and think I am totally tasked, but because of my job, well, I should be totally interpersonal. So I don't have a magical answer for you. I think what you need to do is assess, continue that assessment, but slowly move into, okay, I am very interpersonal, but I also have tasks that need to be done. So how can I still work with and collaborate with my employees and yet push forward my agenda a little bit more? Communication strategy again. Here's my objective. Okay, my objective today is to complete this task. How do I complete that task without abandoning that authenticity that I have in working with my peers? And so keeping in mind leader follower, but also thinking through the message, thinking through what has to be done, and eventually, hopefully you'll float a little closer to the middle on that, right? Strategy is always the go-to. Does that help a little?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else have a question, or maybe you need to get to your case study?
Thank you so much, Linda. That was absolutely fabulous. Yeah, if you're willing to stay on for the case presentation,
Sure.
I think it's a really great one. So I'm going to turn it over to Linda Anderson.
Hello, I'm going to share my screen here and we'll get started on the case study. It's a juicy one. So the background is the frontline supervisor is a supervisor for a residential setting for adults with intellectual disabilities and has been with the agency for about 6 or 7 years. First worked as a